If you close your eyes and imagine the Malabar coast of India in the late Middle Ages, you would not find yourself in silence. The air was thick with the sounds of work, the creak of ropes being coiled, the slap of waves against the hull of small wooden ships, and the low hum of voices bargaining over sacks of dried blackberries that would soon be called by a grander name, pepper. This coast, stretching along the Arabian Sea, was not merely a geographical feature. It was a marketplace of worlds where merchants from Arabia, Persia, and eventually Europe all gathered, waiting for the spice that seemed to command more value than silver. Peppercorns were not grown in neat, disciplined fields. They were cultivated in tangled vines that climbed up the tall trees of Kerala's humid groves. The farmers who tended them were not rich men. They were barefoot workers whose lives were measured by the slow ripening of the berries that would be harvested once or twice a year. Pepper was harvested when still green, then left to dry until it turned black and shriveled, locking in its sharp flavour. A villager might carry just a basket of these berries down to the coast, but by the time those same berries reached the other end of the world, they might be worth enough to pay for a horse, or even a modest house. For the pepper to leave India, however, it had to pass through many hands. On the beaches of Calicut, Cochin and Quilon, the trade was organised with little fanfare. Merchants haggled quietly, weighing the berries on balance scales. The weights were often stones, smooth and dark, calibrated by guilds of local traders who guarded their honesty fiercely. Bargains might last for hours, but once struck, the bags were sewn shut with coarse thread, sealed with wax, and marked with the symbol of the merchant house. It was not just pepper that left these shores, but trust that those bags would reach their destination intact. The vessels that carried the spice across the Arabian Sea were not grand ships like those that later sailed under Portuguese flags. They were dhows, narrow wooden craft with triangular sails of woven cotton. Their decks were cluttered with ropes, coiled nets, and bundles of goods. Pepper sacks would be stacked alongside dried coconuts, ginger, and sometimes even parrots in cages, meant to amuse foreign buyers. The sailors who manned these vessels were accustomed to hardship. They slept on deck, ate from shared pots of rice and fish, and spent long weeks at sea, steering by the stars and praying that the monsoon winds would carry them in the right direction. The voyage from the Malabar coast to the Persian Gulf or the Red Sea was not long in distance, barely a few thousand kilometres, but it was perilous. Sudden storms could overturn ships, while pirates lurked in the shallows near Oman. Merchants knew the risks. They often insured their shipments not with contracts but with family bonds. One man's brother might stand as surety for another's goods. If the ship went down, the loss was shared by the community. For pepper was not just a commodity, it was livelihood. At the great ports of Hormuz and Aden, the pepper took on new value. Arab merchants who had purchased it in India would resell it to others, each middleman taking his share of profit. Pepper, dried and weighty, was ideal for such long chains of trade. Unlike fruits or vegetables, it did not spoil quickly. In fact, sacks of pepper could be stored for months or even years in dark warehouses waiting for prices to rise. Buyers in the Middle East did not merely see pepper as seasoning, they saw it as a form of currency. To give someone a sack of pepper was as secure as giving them a purse of coins. The Venetian merchants who eventually sought pepper in Europe did not usually travel this first leg themselves. Instead, they relied on a system that had existed for centuries. Spices travelled step by step, carried by traders who knew their waters, who spoke the tongues of their regions, and who could negotiate with local rulers. By the time the pepper left the Arabian seas and entered the Mediterranean, it had already passed through so many hands that the farmers in Kerala could not have imagined how far their harvest had gone. But even before it reached Europe, the pepper's journey was still long. To enter the Mediterranean, sacks of pepper might travel by camel caravan across the deserts of Arabia or Egypt. These caravans were slow, methodical affairs. A line of perhaps 200 camels would set out together, each beast carrying 2 heavy sacks balanced across its back. The pace was not hurried. They walked in rhythm, hooves pressing into the sand, the sound of bells ringing softly from their necks. At night, the caravan stopped at wells or oases. The merchants gathered under canvas tents, their ledgers close at hand, and counted the days until they reached Alexandria or Damascus. In these cities, pepper was not hidden away. It was displayed in open sacks at the spice markets, its sharp scent rising into the air. Buyers touched the grains, rubbed them between their fingers, sometimes even biting them to test the sharpness of their flavour. Contracts were written on parchment, signed with ink and sealed with wax. Prices fluctuated wildly. One year pepper might be affordable, the next it might be worth double, depending on the monsoon winds, on piracy, or on the rivalries between kingdoms. When Venetian merchants purchased their share in Alexandria, they were not simply buying seasoning for kitchens, they were securing influence. In Venice, the spice trade fueled not only meals, but also marble palaces and painted ceilings. A handful of peppercorns in Paris or London might seem trivial, but they represented a global chain of work that stretched from barefoot farmers in India to cloaked bankers in Florence. Yet, for all its value, pepper was still fragile. Ships could sink, caravans could be raided, prices could collapse. And so every merchant who invested in the blackberries took a risk. They trusted that the goods would make their way across seas and deserts, across mountains and rivers, until at last they reached the wooden docks of Venice, where gondolas waited to ferry the sacks into the warehouses of the Rialto. The journey of pepper was long, slow, and often invisible to those who later sprinkled it on their meals. But behind each grain was a chain of labour, of suffering, of risk, and of patience. It was a story of endurance, of persistence against storms, hunger, and theft. And so, we are left with a question. When a handful of peppercorns finally reached a cook's hand in Paris, how many lives, how many journeys, how many silent struggles lay hidden in that single pinch of spice? If you picture the journey of pepper from the Malabar coast as a single thread, then this section of its path was woven not on the seas, but across the sands and stone roads of the Near East. Once unloaded at ports such as Aden, Hormuz or Jeddah, the black sacks of dried peppercorns were bound to a new fate. Long caravan journeys across deserts that tested both beasts and men. Imagine a caravan preparing to leave Cairo for the great spice bazaars of Alexandria. The air would be filled with dust as camels groaned under their burdens. Each animal was assigned twin loads, perhaps 50 to 60 kilograms of pepper balanced in thick leather panniers. A single caravan might consist of 200 camels, sometimes more, and each would plod forward in deliberate rhythm, guided by drivers who shouted commands in Arabic, striking the air with sticks to keep the animals moving. The desert was both ally and enemy. Its vast emptiness meant that raiders could be spotted from afar, but it also meant there was little shelter. Merchants timed their departures according to the stars, walking by night to avoid the heat of the day. Fires at camp were kept low, more for warmth and a sense of company than for cooking. A typical meal for caravan men consisted of bread, hardened against their teeth, dates softened in water, and sometimes a little goat's milk. Pepper itself was never tasted by these handlers. It remained sealed in sacks, carefully guarded, its value lying not in use but in promise. At caravanserais, stone inns scattered along the desert routes, pepper was carried inside to rest. These way stations offered wells, shaded courtyards, and places to barter news. A merchant arriving from India might hear rumours of trouble in the Mediterranean, Venetian galleys under attack by Genoese rivals, or new taxes imposed by the Mamluk rulers of Egypt. Such information mattered as much as water. The value of pepper was not just in its sharp taste, but in the timing of its arrival. A caravan delayed by weeks might find that prices had fallen by the time it reached Alexandria. By the 14th century, Venice had secured a unique role in this chain. The Republic, though small in size, dominated Mediterranean commerce. Venetian galleys docked regularly at Alexandria, where they loaded not only pepper but cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg, all carried from India and Southeast Asia through similar networks. But pepper was always the staple, the one spice that could be counted on to sell in vast quantities. In Venetian warehouses, pepper was measured out not by handfuls but by hundreds of sacks, each entered into ledgers that tracked every ducat spent and every sack sold. The Venetian system of trade was bureaucratic in detail. Merchants carried licenses granted by the Republic, contracts were notarized, and disputes were judged by appointed magistrates of commerce. A Venetian merchant investing in pepper might never see the groves of Kerala or the deserts of Arabia, but his gold coin linked him to those far-off places. The Rialto market in Venice became a hub where pepper's global story converged. Imagine standing on its wooden walkways in the late afternoon. Barges glided across the Grand Canal stacked with goods. Porters with bent backs carried sacks on their shoulders, while clerks in long robes shouted figures to scribes who scratched notes with quills. Warehouses smelled of salt, damp wood, and above all the pungent sharpness of pepper. Prices of pepper were posted like the stock exchanges of later centuries. Merchants argued over fluctuations of a few ducats. Entire fortunes were made or lost depending on the arrival of a single convoy of galleys. The Republic itself profited handsomely by taxing every sack that passed through its docks. These revenues financed Venice's fleets, its palaces, and even its wars. Pepper was not simply food. It was infrastructure, military power, and political leverage. But Venice was not the final stop. From its lagoon, smaller shipments were dispatched northward, carried by river barges and pack animals into the heart of Europe. Traders bound for Paris, Bruges, or Cologne purchased pepper in Venice, paying prices inflated by each middleman along the way. These traders were not grand figures in silks. They were practical men, often speaking several languages, carrying small purses of gold and armed only with knives for protection. Their task was not glamorous, but essential. To carry the spice one step further toward its consumers, the Alps posed one of the greatest obstacles. Pepper sacks were hoisted onto the backs of mules or strapped to sledges dragged over icy passes. Snow choked the pathways in winter, and avalanches claimed both beasts and men. Inns along the mountain routes charged high prices for shelter, and yet the traders paid them, knowing that their pepper might fetch even higher sums once it reached the wealthy kitchens of northern Europe. When these traders finally reached cities like Paris, the pepper they carried had become an object of wonder. Few cooks could afford to buy it in bulk. Instead, they purchased it by the ounce, carefully wrapped in parchment. In noble kitchens, pepper was used sparingly in sauces and stews, not to overwhelm flavours but to signify refinement. At feasts, its presence was noted as a mark of wealth, a subtle reminder that the host had access to distant networks of trade. For ordinary people, pepper remained almost mythical. A labourer in Paris might never taste it in his life, unless he was hired to work in the kitchens of a noble house. There, he might smell it as it was ground in mortars of stone, its pungent scent mixing with garlic, onions, and wine, but he would not be permitted to sprinkle it on his own meals. Pepper in this sense marked the lines of class and privilege. Still, even in its exclusivity, pepper influenced culture. Recipes began to specify its use. Medical treatises recommended it as a remedy for cold humours and sluggish digestion. Apothecaries sold pepper in small packets, sometimes blending it with honey or vinegar for tonic drinks. Thus what began as a farmer's harvest in Kerala found its way not only into the pots of Parisian cooks, but also into the prescriptions of physicians and the writings of scholars. Yet the story of pepper was not without tension. Its price fluctuations caused unrest. Chronicles from the 14th century mention disputes in Parisian markets when pepper became scarce or prohibitively expensive. Bakers complained that customers would rather spend coin on a pinch of spice than on bread. Officials worried that too much wealth was flowing outward, across seas, rather than staying within their own cities. Pepper was desired, but it was also distrusted, a symbol of dependence on distant lands. And so we are left to wonder, as Venetian merchants filled their ledgers with profits and Parisian nobles filled their stews with spice, did anyone stop to consider the long human chain stretched across seas, deserts, and mountains, each link bound together by the silent weight of a single peppercorn? By the time pepper reached the kitchens of Paris, London, or Bruges, its journey had stretched across continents and lifetimes. What began as green berries climbing in Kerala's groves had passed through the calloused hands of farmers, the sails of dhows, the bells of desert caravans, the docks of Alexandria, and the ledgers of Venetian traders. Yet the peppercorn story did not end with its arrival. It continued in the way it shaped European culture, economics, and daily life, often in ways so subtle they seemed almost invisible. In Paris, pepper arrived through market stalls clustered around Les Halles, the city's great food market. Buyers approached cautiously, for pepper was not a casual purchase. Unlike onions or cabbages, which were bought by weight or cartload, pepper was bought by the ounce or even the pinch, each portion wrapped carefully in scraps of parchment or cloth. Merchants kept it in small chests, often locked, and weighed it on brass scales that were inspected regularly by city officials to prevent fraud, to see a A merchant's hand dip into a chest of peppercorns was to glimpse not just spice, but wealth. In noble households, pepper was treated with reverence. Cooks ground it fresh with pestles of stone or bronze, sometimes mixed with salt or saffron to create sauces of deep complexity. Stews of beef or lamb, often heavy and greasy, could be lifted by the sharp sting of pepper, making them not only tastier, but also more fashionable. At banquets, dishes seasoned with pepper were placed before honoured guests, a subtle way of declaring status. The host who could season freely with pepper was a man or woman of means and connections. But pepper did not remain confined to kitchens. Physicians prescribed it in their medical manuals, sometimes mixing it with honey to soothe throats, sometimes with vinegar to treat indigestion. Medieval medicine, rooted in the theory of humours, saw pepper as a heating element, capable of countering the cold, phlegmatic imbalance of the body. Apothecaries sold it in packets as though it were both food and drug. To chew on a single peppercorn was thought to revive the weary spirit, warm the stomach, and awaken the senses. Monasteries too valued pepper, not for indulgent feasting, though abbots were not immune to rich dishes, but for preservation. Pepper, ground and mixed with salt, helped preserve meat and fish, extending their use in seasons when fresh food was scarce. The monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight sometimes recorded the prices of spices in their margins, not out of idle curiosity, but because pepper represented a significant expense in a monastery's yearly budget. In cities, pepper became an economic anchor. Tax records from the 14th and 15th centuries often list pepper as a source of revenue. Kings and dukes imposed duties on its trade, knowing that people would pay. Some lords even accepted pepper in place of rent, allowing tenants to settle accounts by delivering a sack of spice instead of coin. This practice gave rise to the phrase peppercorn rent, meaning a token payment, a phrase still in use centuries later. Yet pepper was more than currency. It was a symbol of Europe's growing dependence on distant worlds. Each grain whispered of India, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. When a cook in Paris ground pepper over a dish, he was participating in a global chain of trade, whether he knew it or not. And with every pinch, he contributed to the flow of wealth outward. Wealth that paid for ships in Venice, palaces in Florence, and fortresses along desert routes. Over time, pepper also sparked rivalries. Venice's dominance over the spice trade bred resentment in Genoa, Florence, and later in Portugal and Spain. By the 15th century, the quest to break Venice's monopoly pushed Europeans to seek direct sea routes to India. The voyages of Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama were driven less by dreams of discovery and more by the desire to bypass the middlemen and reach the Malabar coast themselves. In this sense, pepper was not merely a kitchen spice, it was a motive for exploration, colonization, and conflict. But before that age of exploration, in the medieval world, pepper remained a rare treasure. Chroniclers described feasts where nobles displayed pepper openly, as though it were gold dust. In Paris, inventories of wealthy merchants listed pepper alongside silver cups and fine fabrics. In Florence, bankers noted loans denominated in sacks of spice. In London, records survive of ships docked on the Thames unloading pepper to be stored in locked warehouses under guard. Everywhere, pepper meant value, but also fragility. It could spoil if wet, be stolen if unguarded, or lose value if too much entered the market at once. Ordinary people rarely touched it. For them, pepper was a rumour, a faint scent drifting from noble kitchens, a word whispered at markets. They seasoned their food with onions, garlic and herbs from their gardens, never with the black grains that came from half a world away. And yet, even in absence, pepper shaped their lives. Taxes raised to fund spice imports affected all. Wars fought to secure trade routes disrupted all. Pepper was distant, but its consequences were near. It is worth pausing here in thought to consider how much patience and labour lay hidden in a single medieval dish seasoned with pepper. The farmer in Kerala climbing trees to harvest berries, the sailor guiding a dhow through monsoon winds, the camel driver trudging through Arabian sands, the Venetian clerk scratching figures into a ledger, the Parisian cook grinding a mortar in a smoky kitchen. Each one contributed a link invisible to the others, yet bound together by commerce. And so pepper, in its quiet way, changed Europe. It fueled not only taste but ambition. It encouraged trade, demanded diplomacy, and provoked exploration. It blurred the lines between food and medicine, between necessity and luxury. It filled ledgers, shaped fortunes, and inspired envy. By the time the 15th century closed and new sea routes to India were opened, pepper had already written itself into European history. It had transformed from a farmer's harvest into a symbol of global exchange, yet its legacy remained humble, resting in the kitchens of Paris and beyond, a pinch at a time, flavouring soups and sauces, never dramatic, never loud, but always there, always quietly shaping the story of food and trade. And so we end this first journey with a reflection. When you hold a single peppercorn today, do you see merely a spice? Or do you glimpse the invisible chain of farmers, sailors, merchants and cooks who once carried these black grains across half the known world? In candlelit chambers, Bruges merchants untied cloth sacks, counting coins one by one, each clink echoing through halls where trade bound distant worlds. If Venice was the watery gateway of pepper and spice, then Bruges, in the Low Countries, was the counting room of Europe. To walk its cobbled streets in the 14th century was to hear the sound of coins, not the jangle of loose purses, but the careful clink of scales weighing silver, the scraping of tally sticks, the rustle of parchment contracts sealed with wax. Bruges was not a port in the grand sense of galleys and fleets. It lay inland, connected by canals to the North Sea. But it was a marketplace where the world's wealth was measured, traded, and turned into power. The merchants of Bruges did not deal only in sacks of pepper, bales of wool, or barrels of wine. They dealt above all in coin. They counted, weighed, and exchanged currencies from across Europe. Ducats of Venice, florins of Florence, English sterling pennies, French livres. The problem was not lack of money, but too much of it. Too many different coins circulating, each with its own weight, purity, and trustworthiness. For this reason, the merchant's most important tool was not his chest of goods, but his set of scales. Picture a merchant's counting house in Bruges. The building itself might look plain from the outside, its walls of brick leaning slightly inward, its shutters closed against the damp air. Inside, however, the space was filled with order. A broad wooden table held rows of coins, sorted into neat piles. A pair of scales stood ready, the pans gleaming from constant use. Next to them lay small boxes of test stones and files, tools for examining coins suspected of being clipped or counterfeit. In the corner, a strongbox reinforced with iron bands held the merchant's reserves, guarded by locks whose keys were divided among trusted partners. The process of exchange was slow, methodical, and to outsiders dull. A man from England might bring a bag of silver pennies to pay for Flemish wool. The merchant would pour them out on the table, spreading them with his fingers, listening to their ring as they struck each other. Each coin would be weighed, for even the smallest shaving of silver altered its value. If the pennies passed inspection, they might be exchanged for florins of Florence, more widely trusted in Mediterranean trade. The merchant would then record the transaction in a ledger, the numbers written in careful columns by a clerk trained to keep steady hand and neat figures. Bruges became a hub because of this trust. Merchants from Italy, England, Germany and the Baltic came not only to buy goods, but to settle debts. In the counting rooms, agreements were made that stretched across borders. An English wool dealer might borrow from a Florentine banker, promising to repay with proceeds from the next year's fair. A Hanseatic trader from Lübeck might deposit profits from selling timber, knowing that a Flemish merchant would hold the money safely until it was needed again. Bruges, in this sense, functioned as a primitive bank long before banks were common. The city itself facilitated this role. Bruges was part of Flanders, under the rule of counts, who recognised the value of commerce. They granted privileges to foreign merchants, protection of goods, fair hearing in disputes, the right to establish trading houses. Italians built their own fondacos, or lodges, where they lived and stored goods. The Hanseatic League, that great alliance of northern cities, established a contour in Bruges, a kind of fortified warehouse where their members could trade under their own laws. Each group kept its traditions, but all relied on Bruges' marketplace as common ground. Coins in Bruges were not static. They moved constantly, flowing like water through the city's veins. Market days saw them exchanged for cloth, wine, fish, and spice. Fairs drew merchants from afar, each bringing bags of coins wrapped in cloth, each leaving with a different currency entirely. The clerks who kept ledgers had to be skilled in conversion, able to shift from one system of value to another. Tables of equivalents circulated, showing how many English pennies equalled a Florentine florin or a Venetian ducat. Mistakes could ruin a merchant, so precision was a matter of survival. Yet with coin came suspicion. Counterfeiters lurked in every corner of Europe, clipping the edges of coins or forging new ones from base metals. To guard against this, Bruges developed a culture of scrutiny. Merchants tested coins on touchstones, rubbed them against files, bit them between their teeth. Authorities minted their own coinage, but foreign coins always flooded in. The city's reputation depended on careful inspection, for if Bruges became known as careless, the merchants would take their trade elsewhere. For the ordinary townspeople, the presence of so much coin shaped daily life. Innkeepers were paid in mixed currencies, bakers weighed silver pennies before accepting them, and even small market sellers learned to recognise the ring of good silver. Children grew up listening to the sound of counting, the careful clink that meant their city thrived. But beneath the routine of coin counting lay deeper tensions. The wealth of Bruges attracted envy and conflict. Rival cities like Gien and Ypres resented its dominance. Rulers demanded taxes, sometimes threatening to revoke privileges unless they were paid. Wars in France or England disrupted trade, cutting off flows of goods and money. Each time conflict arose, the counting houses fell silent, their scales unused, their ledgers closed. Merchants lived with this uncertainty, knowing that the flow of coins was as fragile as the peace that protected it. Still, Bruges endured. Its merchants were cautious, pragmatic, and skilled in the slow art of turning goods into money and money into goods again. They didn't wield swords, but their scales and ledgers carried equal weight in shaping the fate of Europe. And so the first question arises, when a sack of peppercorns finally reached Bruges, weighed, sold, and converted into coins of mixed origin, did anyone pause to consider how many times its value had been counted, recalculated and rewritten before it ever flavoured a single dish? If Bruges was a counting room, then its guilds were the custodians of order. The city did not leave money to flow without rules. It wrapped commerce in layers of regulation, ritual and tradition. Merchant guilds, craft guilds, and foreign trading lodges each played a role in ensuring that the fragile balance of trust was maintained. For in a city where a single clipped coin could undermine confidence, rules mattered as much as walls or weapons. The Merchant Guild of Bruges was not a society of flamboyant traders in silks. It was a sober institution, governed by statutes that prescribed how business should be conducted. Members pledged to keep honest weights and measures, to avoid cheating in contracts, and to settle disputes through arbitration rather than violence. Guild officials inspected scales, examined coins, and ensured that transactions were recorded. Fines were levied on those who broke the rules, not merely to punish, but to reassure all merchants that trust remained intact. Yet Bruges was no closed world. It thrived precisely because it opened its doors to outsiders. Italians from Florence, Genoa and Venice built lodges known as fondacos, where they lived, stored goods, and met to discuss trade. These fondacos were miniature cities within the city, marked by their own chapels, kitchens and sleeping quarters. The Italians brought not only spices and silks, but also their accounting methods, double-entry bookkeeping, contracts notarized with legal precision, and letters of exchange that allowed money to move without heavy coin. To a Bruges merchant watching an Italian clerk scratch neat lines of figures into a ledger, it must have seemed both mysterious and powerful. The Hanseatic League, representing the cities of the Baltic and North Sea, established its contour in Bruges. This was more than a warehouse, it was a fortified community with its own gates, guards and meeting halls. Hanseatic merchants dealt in timber, fish, wax and furs, but they also brought in coins minted in distant towns like Lübeck or Hamburg. The contour operated under its own laws, yet remained deeply entwined with the life of Bruges. On market days, its gates opened and wagons rolled in, bringing the north into contact with the south. English merchants too played their part. They brought the wool of their sheep, which was the foundation of Flemish cloth making. Without English wool, Bruges' looms would have stood silent. The merchants of England were granted privileges by the counts of Flanders, allowing them to trade freely in exchange for regular taxes. Their presence meant that bags of English sterling flowed into Bruges, adding yet another currency to the mix. Trust, however, was always fragile. A Florentine might wonder whether an English penny was clipped. A Hanseatic trader might suspect that a Venetian ducat was of lighter gold. To overcome this, Bruges relied on a culture of testing and certification. Official weighhouses were established where goods and coins could be measured under supervision. Seals of the city were affixed to sacks and barrels, guaranteeing their content. Merchants knew that a seal of Bruges meant reliability, and thus the city's reputation grew. But reputation was a delicate thing. One scandal could undo years of trust. Chronicles tell of disputes where merchants accused each other of fraud, leading to prolonged trials before the city magistrates. Sometimes foreign powers intervened, threatening to withdraw their traders if justice was not done. Bruges had to walk carefully, balancing the interests of Italians, Hanseatics, English and locals, ensuring that none felt cheated, for if one withdrew, the flow of trade might shift to rival cities. Inside the counting houses, foreign influences mingled. Italian double-entry ledgers began to influence Flemish bookkeeping. Hanseatic methods of bulk transport shaped storage in Bruges' warehouses. English habits of long-term credit reshaped contracts. Each group guarded its secrets, but over time practices blended, creating a common language of commerce. Coins were still diverse, but the methods of counting and recording them grew increasingly standardized. In taverns and guild halls, merchants discussed not only prices but also politics. Wars between England and France, conflicts in Italy, or disputes over Baltic trade routes, all could disrupt business. A caravan of pepper halted in Alexandria, a ship sunk in the North Sea, a wool convoy delayed by fighting in Calais. All had ripple effects in Bruges. Merchants therefore pressed city leaders to negotiate safe conducts, treaties and truces. The prosperity of Bruges depended not only on its own vigilance, but on the delicate peace of Europe. The city itself reflected this blend of cultures. Walking through Bruges in the late Middle Ages, you might hear a dozen languages in a single street: Italian, French, Middle Low German, English, Dutch. Signs above warehouses bore foreign symbols. Churches were endowed by foreign guilds. Even food reflected this diversity, with spices from Venice, salted herring from the Baltic, and English ale all available. Bruges was not just a marketplace, it was a crossroads of Europe's worlds. Yet beneath this bustle lay tension. Locals sometimes resented the privileges given to foreigners. Riots occasionally broke out, directed at Italians or Hanseatics accused of arrogance or profiteering. City authorities had to tread carefully, reminding citizens that the wealth of Bruges depended on this international presence. Too much hostility, and the merchants would leave for Antwerp or Ghent, taking their coins with them. The guilds sought to mediate these tensions. They emphasized fairness, established codes of conduct, and tried to ensure that disputes did not boil over into violence. Still, no set of rules could entirely prevent jealousy. A weaver who earned little might look with envy at the foreign merchant counting coins in his lodge. A craftsman who struggled to pay rent might resent the privileges of Hanseatic traders living under their own laws. The prosperity of Bruges was real, but it was unevenly shared. At night, when the counting houses closed and the taverns quieted, the city still hummed with the presence of money. Strong boxes clicked shut, keys hidden away in pockets. Merchants slept lightly, knowing that fortunes lay in their cellars. Guards patrolled the streets, for thieves always prowled where coins clustered. The moonlight glinted off the canals, carrying with it the reflection of towers built from trade. And so, the question lingers. In a city where trust had to be constantly guarded, seals checked and scales tested, how long could Bruges maintain its role as Europe's trusted counting room before suspicion, rivalry and conflict began to unravel the web? By the 15th century, Bruges stood at the height of its prosperity. Its markets bustled with wool from England, furs from the Baltic, spices from Venice, and silks from Genoa. Its counting houses recorded debts that stretched across Europe, and its guild halls echoed with voices in many tongues. But prosperity is rarely permanent. Just as coins can be clipped, so too can a city's fortune be shaved away, little by little, until only memory remains. The first blow came from nature itself. Bruges' connection to the sea relied on a channel that wound through the sand dunes to the port of Dam. Over the years, silting clogged this channel, making it harder for large ships to reach the city. Merchants complained of delays, of barges stuck in shallow waters, of cargo needing to be unloaded and reloaded at great expense. Engineers were hired, canals were dug, sluices were built, but the sea is not easily commanded. Slowly, almost invisibly, Bruges' lifeline began to choke. At the same time, rivals stirred. Antwerp, further inland along the Scheldt River, began to rise. Its port was deeper, its access to the sea more reliable. Merchants began to shift their cargoes there, testing new markets. What began as a trickle became a steady flow. By the early 16th century, Antwerp was becoming what Bruges had once been, the counting room of Europe. Inside Bruges, the signs of decline were subtle but real. The great foreign lodges lost their energy. The Italian Fondaco saw fewer ships arrive, their warehouses no longer stacked with silks and spices. The Hanseatic contour, once bustling with northern traders, grew quiet. English wool merchants redirected their goods and their sterling coins to other ports. Bruges still had merchants, but their ledgers recorded fewer transactions, their scales weighed fewer coins. The city authorities tried to resist. They passed laws to encourage trade, offered privileges, and attempted to dredge the channels. They built new warehouses, hoping to lure merchants back. But trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. Merchants are cautious creatures. They go where the flow of goods is easiest, where the weighing of coins is least troubled. Bruges could no longer promise that security. Yet for a time, the memory of Bruges' greatness lingered. The city still held grand fairs, where contracts were signed and debts settled. Italian bankers still maintained small offices, paying interest on old loans. Guilds still enforced their rules, inspecting scales and weights. The rhythm of coin counting did not vanish overnight. It simply grew quieter, like a bell rung at greater distance. For the townspeople, decline was harder to ignore. Craftsmen found fewer customers. Tavern keepers sold less wine. Bakers noticed that coins arrived more slowly across their counters. The hum of languages that once filled the streets grew fainter. Where once a dozen tongues were heard, now only a handful. Bruges was not deserted, but it was diminished. Still, in its decline, Bruges left a legacy. The systems of trade it fostered, the weighing of coins, the certification of goods, the contracts written in precise ledgers, spread elsewhere. Antwerp, Amsterdam, and eventually London inherited its practices. The idea that trust in trade must be guaranteed not just by individuals but by institutions was a lesson Bruges taught Europe. Its guilds, lodges and weighhouses became models for others. Even in decline, Bruges shaped the future. Today, when historians open the old ledgers of Bruges, they find not just numbers but stories. A loan from an Italian banker to an English wool merchant, a contract between a Hanseatic trader and a Flemish cloth maker, a record of pepper sold by the ounce, its price rising and falling with the winds of the monsoon. Each entry is dry, repetitive, and, on the surface, boring. But taken together, they reveal a city at the centre of a network that bound Europe together. The merchants who once counted coins in cloth sacks are long gone, but their discipline remains. The insistence on honest scales, the habit of recording debts, the culture of testing and trust, these are the foundations of modern banking and trade. Bruges may have faded, but its methods endured, shaping the markets of Antwerp, Amsterdam, and far beyond. And so we close the account of Bruges with one final question. When the last merchant locked his strongbox, when the last foreign lodge closed its doors, did the people of Bruges realise that their city's fortune was slipping away? Or did they still believe, as coins clinked softly in their scales, that the counting would never end? Beneath creaking decks, spice chests perfumed the air while damp holds grew mould, a mingling of luxury and hardship on long trade voyages. When one imagines the medieval spice trade, it is tempting to picture gleaming sacks of pepper and cinnamon stacked neatly in clean warehouses. But the true story of how those goods crossed oceans lies in the holds of ships, dark, damp, and foul-smelling. Life at sea was not romantic, it was survival. And survival shaped both the men who sailed and the spices that endured the journey. Consider first the ships themselves. By the 14th century, Mediterranean merchants favoured round-hulled cogs and later carracks, vessels that could hold more cargo than the slender dhows of the Arabian Sea. Their holds were cavernous, built of oak timbers sealed with tar and lined with rough planks. Into these spaces went everything: sacks of pepper, bales of cloth, barrels of wine, coils of rope, and sometimes even livestock. Order was attempted but rarely achieved. Pepper sacks might sit beside damp hides. Cinnamon bundles might rest near leaky barrels of fish oil. The mingling of scents created an atmosphere so pungent that sailors joked they could smell a ship before they saw it. For sailors, the loading of spice chests was back-breaking work. At the docks of Alexandria or Venice, teams of porters carried sacks on their shoulders, stumbling down gangplanks into the ship's belly. There, stevedores arranged the cargo with care. Pepper, dense and valuable, was stacked in the centre, far from the hull where seawater could not reach it. Barrels of wine and water lined the sides, both to balance the ship and to shield the spices from damp. Yet no arrangement could prevent the slow creep of mould. Holds were poorly ventilated, and the air turned musty within days. The sailors themselves lived above this cargo, but not by much. Cabins were small, dark spaces divided by wooden planks. Most men slept on straw mats, wrapped in rough blankets, their heads filled with the creak of the timbers and the groan of the sea. Food was meagre: hardtack biscuits infested with weevils, salted meat so tough it had to be boiled for hours, dried beans, and when fortune allowed, a bit of cheese. Spices like pepper were never eaten by sailors. They were too valuable. Sailors seasoned their food with onions, garlic, or nothing at all. Work at sea was constant. Ropes had to be hauled, sails trimmed, decks scrubbed. The greatest fear was not pirates or storms, but rot. A single leak in a barrel of water could ruin nearby sacks of spice. Mould could creep unnoticed, turning pepper into worthless dust. To prevent this, sailors checked the holds daily, opening sacks to feel for dampness, shifting goods to allow air to circulate. They worked by torchlight, coughing in the smoky air, sweat running down their backs. Disease was another constant threat. With so many men confined in small spaces, sickness spread quickly. Fevers, dysentery and scurvy claimed lives. A man weakened by illness was often left to lie on deck, covered with a cloak while the ship pressed on. Burial was at sea, the body sewn into a canvas shroud, weighted with stones and slid overboard with a prayer. The spices in the hold did not pause for grief. Trade was indifferent to human suffering. Despite hardship, life aboard ship developed rhythms. Bells rang to mark watches. Men worked. In shifts, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. At night they steered by the stars, guided by the North Star in the Mediterranean, or by more complex constellations further south. The captain kept charts and logs, noting winds, currents and landmarks. Merchants aboard checked their cargo obsessively, counting sacks, sealing chests, marking ledgers. Trust at sea was fragile and theft was not unknown. A sailor caught pilfering pepper could face brutal punishment, sometimes flogging, sometimes worse. In calmer moments, sailors found ways to pass the time. They sang shanties, carved bits of wood, or told stories of ports visited. Many had never seen the groves where pepper grew, nor the markets of Paris where it sold, but they knew the worth of the black grains better than anyone. They handled them daily, smelled their pungent bite, and understood that their voyage depended on keeping them safe. Storms, when they came, turned order into chaos. Waves crashed over the deck, barrels shifted, sacks split open. Men scrambled to secure the cargo, to tie ropes around shifting loads, to bail water from the hold. The smell of wet pepper, sharp, acrid, was both a curse and a warning. If too much was soaked, fortunes would be lost. Merchants prayed louder than sailors in those moments, clutching their ledgers as if numbers could save them from the sea. When ships finally reached safe harbour, the relief was palpable. Pepper sacks were hoisted onto the docks, their wax seals checked, their weight measured once again. Merchants compared notes, arguing over losses, debating how much mould or dampness could be tolerated before goods were deemed spoiled. Even a small reduction in quality could cut profits sharply. For sailors, unloading meant rest, but only briefly, for another cargo awaited, another voyage demanded. The holds of these ships, damp and mouldy, were not glamorous, but they were the true engines of medieval trade. Without them, no pepper reached Paris, no cinnamon-spiced Venetian wine, no cloves perfumed the kitchens of Bruges. The holds carried not only goods, but also the hopes and fears of merchants, the labour of sailors, and the fragile balance of Europe's economy. And so we are left with a question: how much of medieval wealth, how many feasts and fortunes, rested not on kings or castles, but on the silent endurance of spices packed in mouldy, darkened holds? To live on a medieval trading ship was to live in a world of strict order and deep uncertainty. The sea allowed little room for chaos, yet it offered nothing but unpredictability. Between the mouldy holds where pepper and cinnamon sweated in silence and the creaking decks where sailors pulled ropes, there existed a fragile balance. Discipline kept the men in line, superstition kept their fears at bay, and storms reminded them how small they truly were. Discipline came first. Life aboard was divided by the ringing of bells. 4-hour watches rotated day and night. One man took the helm, another kept lookout at the bow, others hauled ropes or scrubbed the decks. The captain's authority was absolute. His word determined the ship's course, the rationing of food, and the punishment of offenders. Disobedience was rare but not unknown. A sailor who struck another might be shackled in irons, forced to stand exposed on deck as waves crashed over him. Theft was punished harshly. A stolen peppercorn was treated not as a trifle, but as a crime against every man on board, for its loss could mean a merchant's wrath, a voyage's ruin. Rations reinforced this order. Every man received a set portion of hardtack, salted fish, beans and thin beer or watered wine. The food was monotonous, often mouldy, sometimes crawling with weevils. Yet it was carefully counted and distributed, for supplies had to last weeks or even months. Sailors learned to soak hardtack in water to soften it, to scrape mould from cheese, to eat in silence while the ship rolled beneath them. Fresh food was rare. A barrel of onions might last a few weeks. A few hens might provide eggs at the start of the journey, but soon all that remained were dry stores. Men dreamed of fruit and fresh bread the way others dreamed of gold. Disease stalked these rations. Scurvy, though unnamed, haunted long voyages. Men's gums swelled, teeth loosened, wounds festered. Fevers spread quickly in the close quarters of the forecastle, where men slept shoulder to shoulder. Dysentery weakened them further, and there was little a ship's surgeon, if one was present, could do beyond bleeding, poultices, or prayer. To fall ill at sea was to rely on comrades for scraps of care, and often to be wrapped in canvas and cast into the waves. Yet fear was not fought by medicine but by superstition. Sailors believed in omens. A red sunrise meant storms. A bird landing on the mast was good fortune, unless it was a crow, in which case it foretold death. Whistling was forbidden, thought to summon storms. Coins were nailed to the mast to appease the sea. Many ships carried small icons or relics, a cross, a saint's bone, even a pebble from a holy shrine. Before voyages, priests often blessed ships, sprinkling holy water over the decks. Still, in the black hours of the night, when the ship creaked and waves hissed, men whispered charms under their breath, appealing to saints or stars. Storms brought these fears to life. A sudden gale could strip sails, snap masts, and send men sliding across the deck. Cargo shifted in the holds, barrels rolling, sacks bursting, spices spilling into the bilge water. The smell of wet pepper, sharp and pungent, mixed with the stench of tar and vomit. Men scrambled to pump water, their arms aching as the sea poured in faster than they could bail. Lightning illuminated the rigging. Rain stung their eyes, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. In those moments, order broke down into raw survival. The captain barked orders above the roar: shorten the sails, lash the barrels, tie yourselves, down. Sailors tied ropes around their waist to keep from being swept away. Some prayed loudly, others cursed, others worked in silence. The storm made no distinction. Noble merchants and lowly sailors alike faced the same waves. Many a merchant's fortune ended not in a market dispute, but in a sudden gale that swallowed ship, men and cargo whole. When storms passed, relief was tempered by exhaustion. Men collapsed on the deck, their bodies bruised, their clothes soaked. The cargo had to be inspected, sacks of pepper checked for dampness, barrels counted, damage assessed. Losses were entered into ledgers, even at sea. Merchants demanded records, for insurance claims awaited in port. A spoiled cargo might mean bankruptcy, and sailors knew they would be blamed if negligence was found. Morale, fragile at the best of times, was tested constantly. To keep spirits from breaking, sailors sang work songs. Their chants rose and fell with the pulling of ropes, a rhythm that made labour lighter. At night, tales were told of distant ports, of Alexandria's markets glowing with lamps, of Venice's palaces, of Parisian feasts. Younger sailors listened wide-eyed, though most knew they might never see such places. Friendship mattered. Men formed bonds with shipmates, sharing scraps of food, stories of families left behind, or promises to watch over one another in storms. Yet quarrels were inevitable. Confined in tight quarters, tempers flared over small things. A stolen blanket, an insult, a disputed share of beer. The captain and mate spent as much time keeping peace as steering the ship. Through it all, the Peppercorns sat silently in their sacks. They neither rotted quickly nor spoiled easily, but they absorbed the voyage's hardship all the same. Mould threatened them, salt air tainted them, seawater ruined them if sacks split open. Men risked their lives to protect them, for without the cargo the voyage had no purpose. Spices were not eaten, not smelled, not touched. They were guarded, counted, and endured, much like the sailors themselves. And so, we are left with a thought. In the dark nights of storms and the endless monotony of rationed meals, who carried greater weight? The sailors who fought to keep the ship afloat, or the silent sacks of pepper whose survival justified the voyage? At last, after weeks or months of hardship, when the coastline appeared faint on the horizon and gulls wheeled overhead, the ship's crew felt relief ripple through their tired bodies. Land meant rest, food, and safety. But for the merchants aboard, the sight of harbour towers rising from the mist meant something else entirely: reckoning. The voyage was only successful if the Pepper survived the sea. As the ship crept into port, shouts echoed from dockworkers on shore. Ropes were tossed, anchors dropped, and the vessel steadied at last after so many nights of rolling waves. The first task was unloading the cargo. Porters filed down into the hold, their torches, revealing the damp, musty space where pepper sacks had endured storms and mould. Each sack was hoisted by rope, lifted onto waiting carts or the shoulders of labourers, and carried up into the light. The air at the docks filled with the scent of spice, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, sharp and unmistakable. But unloading was not merely physical work, it was also an act of scrutiny. Inspectors stood ready with scales and seals. Each sack was weighed, its wax seal examined. Merchants leaned close, sniffing the goods, rubbing peppercorns between their fingers, checking for dampness or mould. A single spoiled sack could spark disputes. Whose negligence had caused the loss? The sailors who failed to pump water fast enough? The stevedores who stacked cargo poorly? Or was it simply the sea's will? Arguments broke out on the docks as merchants and captains defended themselves, voices raised above the creak of cranes and the cries of porters. Sometimes disputes went to court. Maritime law in cities like Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona dealt with such cases constantly. A cargo spoiled by seawater might lead to arbitration, with damages awarded to merchants, or sometimes losses shared among investors. These hearings were slow, filled with ledgers, witnesses, and oaths. To the sailor who had hauled ropes in storms, it must have seemed absurd that so much paper was spent on beans of spice. Yet in truth, the value of those black grains outweighed his entire year's wages. For sailors, arrival meant pay. Wages were often given not in coin, but in portions of cargo. A sailor might receive a small sack of pepper as his due, which he could sell in the market for more than his weekly pay at sea. Some squandered their earnings quickly in taverns, wine, ale, and women, erasing months of hardship in a few nights. Others sent their small share home, a gift to families who might never taste pepper themselves but could sell it for bread and firewood. The merchants, however, thought only of profit. Pepper was unloaded, dried if damp, repackaged in fresh cloth, and dispatched along trade routes to Bruges, Paris, London, or beyond. The mouldy holds were forgotten. What mattered now was the price the spice would fetch. Letters were sent to partners in distant cities, detailing arrivals, weights, and market trends. Ledgers filled with new entries. The voyage was closed, but the chain of commerce continued. And yet, despite the merchants' focus on coin, the memory of the voyage lingered among sailors. They remembered the smell of wet pepper in storms, the groans of barrels shifting, the cries of comrades swept overboard. Some swore never to sail again, others signed on for the next voyage, bound by need or by the strange pull of the sea. For them, the holds were not just spaces of commerce, but spaces of endurance, where lives were tested and lost. The legacy of these mouldy holds reached far beyond the docks. They shaped the very rhythm of medieval trade. Without ships capable of carrying pepper safely, Europe's taste for spice would never have grown. Without sailors willing to risk storms and disease, merchants' ledgers would have been empty. Without the careful inspection of cargo, trust in the spice trade would have collapsed. The holds may have been damp, foul, and hidden from view, but they were the foundation of a global network. Over time, improvements were made. Shipbuilders designed stronger hulls, better ventilation for cargo, more reliable pumps for water. Merchants demanded drier sacks, sealed with pitch or wax. Regulations required captains to record damage at sea, ensuring accountability. Each step was born out of lessons learned in the mouldy darkness of the holds. But for the medieval sailor, little changed. He still slept beside rats, ate weevilled bread, and prayed through storms. He still hauled pepper sacks on his back and scrubbed the decks with salt water. He still lived a life of hardship so that nobles in Paris might sprinkle a pinch of pepper on their stews. His world was invisible to those who enjoyed the spice, yet it was essential to its presence on their tables. And so we return to the peppercorn itself, that small black bead of flavour. It carried within it not only the sharpness of India's groves, but also the dampness of European holds, the sweat of sailors, the ink of merchants, and the disputes of courts. Each grain was a world condensed, a reminder of the unseen labour that brought it across seas. The mouldy holds, dark and foul though they were the true crucibles of medieval trade. And so we must ask, when a medieval diner sprinkled pepper over his stew, did he ever pause to imagine the darkness, the damp, and the human struggle that had delivered that single grain to his bowl? Step by step along narrow paths, pack mules carried their burdens in silence, crossing the snowy Alps while bells chimed faintly in the cold air. If the seas carried pepper from India to Venice, it was the mountains that carried it further inland. Between Venice and the markets of Paris or Bruges stood the Alps, towering snow-clad walls of stone, both barrier and passage. Ships could carry goods swiftly, but mules, silent, stubborn and slow, were the true vehicles of medieval trade across these rugged heights. Their hooves wrote the story of commerce into the rocks of narrow passes, one careful step at a time. Picture the scene at the base of the Alps in late autumn. Merchants arriving from Venice with their cargoes of pepper and spice found the roads narrowing, climbing into ridges where carts could not pass. Here, porters and muleteers waited, men hardened by years of leading animals through snow and scree. Their work was humble, but without them, the trade stopped. A sack of pepper that survived months at sea could still be lost to a single slip on a mountain path. Each mule carried a balanced load, one sack of pepper on either side tied securely with the ropes of hemp. A mule could carry perhaps 100 to 150 kilograms, depending on its strength. Lines of animals, sometimes 50 or more, began their slow ascent. Their bells jingled softly, a rhythmic music against the silence of pine forests and rocky cliffs. Muleteers walked alongside, staffs in hand, speaking in low voices, coaxing or scolding their beasts. The animals were stubborn but steady, sure-footed in places where a man alone might stumble. The passes were not roads as we imagine them today. They were narrow trails, sometimes little more than ledges cut into rock. Snow covered them in winter, turning the paths into treacherous sheets of ice. Avalanches were constant threats. In summer, torrents from melting glaciers flooded valleys, sweeping away bridges. The muleteers knew every hazard, every bend where the wind struck hardest, every cliff where one false step meant disaster. Their knowledge, passed from father to son, was as vital as any map. At night, caravans stopped at mountain hospices, stone lodges built by monks high in the passes. These hospices, like the famous ones at the Great St. Bernard Pass, offered shelter to travellers and animals alike. Fires warmed the halls, bowls of broth were shared, and monks recorded the names of those who passed. Many a merchant's life was saved by these shelters when storms trapped caravans for days. Without them, the Alps might have swallowed even more lives than they already claimed. For the muleteers, the journey was both routine and grueling. They rose before dawn, loaded their beasts in the cold grey light, and walked until dusk. Their boots wore thin on rocks, their cloaks soaked through by sleet. They carried little food, bread, cheese, dried meat. Their hands were calloused from ropes, their lungs raw from the thin mountain air. Yet they endured step after step because the trade depended on them. Their wages were modest, but steady, and in a world of uncertainty, that was enough. The mules themselves were central to this endurance. Hardy, smaller than horses but more resilient, they could navigate slopes impossible for carts. They rarely panicked, though they were known to halt suddenly, refusing to move until coaxed. A single caravan might lose an animal to a fall, its load tumbling into ravines never recovered. Muleteers mourned the loss less as tragedy than as calculation. A lost mule meant a lost sack of pepper, a deduction from wages, a black mark in the merchant's ledger. Merchants, when they travelled with their goods, walked among the caravans in heavy cloaks, their purses tied securely, their ledgers wrapped in waxed leather. They worried less about avalanches than about theft. Bandits lurked in forests at the foothills, ready to strike lone travellers. Caravans therefore moved in groups, dozens of men and animals together, a small army of trade. Armed guards sometimes accompanied them, carrying crossbows or pikes, their pay justified by the constant threat of ambush. Despite the dangers, the Alpine routes were lifelines. They linked Italy to northern Europe, Venice to Bruges, Florence to Paris. Spices crossed them, but so too did wool, wine, and silver. Each sack on a mule's back represented not only profit but connection, proof that mountains could not isolate Europe's regions forever. The Alps divided, but the muleteers united. It is easy to forget their silence. Chroniclers wrote of kings and battles, of merchants and markets, but rarely of the men who led mules through snow. Yet their work left its mark. Trails widened into roads, paths into passes, hospices grew into landmarks of mercy. Coins counted in Bruges or Paris bore the weight of pepper that had once swayed on the backs of mountain beasts. And so, as the caravans disappeared into misty valleys, bells fading into distance, one wonders, when a peppercorn was ground into a stew in Paris, did anyone hear the echo of mule bells across the Alps that had carried it there? To speak of the Alpine routes only in terms of mule bells and narrow paths is to soften their reality. The truth was harsher. Every caravan that attempted to cross faced three persistent threats: the mountain itself, the men who preyed upon travellers, and the weariness that gnawed at both beasts and humans as days dragged into weeks. The mountains made their power known most violently in avalanches. In winter and spring, snow clung to slopes like a loaded bowstring, waiting for the slightest sound to set it loose. A mule's misplaced hoof, a man's shout, even the jingling of bells could send tons of ice and rock crashing down. Muleteers developed a language of silence in dangerous places. They hushed their animals, muffled bells with cloth, and gestured instead of speaking. Entire caravans crept across snowfields in utter quiet, each man aware that one mistake could erase them all. When avalanches struck, there was no escape. The snow buried animals, men and cargo alike, sealing pepper and cloth beneath frozen tombs. Monks of mountain hospices sometimes dug for days after such disasters, uncovering twisted packs or broken bells long after life was gone. If the mountain was merciless, men could be cruel as well. Bandits haunted the foothills and lower passes, preying on travellers weighed down with goods. They struck at dawn or dusk, when caravans were tired, their guards inattentive. Armed with crossbows, cudgels or knives, they emerged from forests demanding coin and cargo. Muleteers resisted when they could, but most often they yielded, for pepper was not worth a life. Merchants sometimes paid tolls to local lords or hired armed escorts to reduce the danger. Still, tales spread of caravans stripped bare, their loads stolen, their men left bound in snow. The toll stations themselves were double-edged. Local rulers, counts, bishops or barons, controlled mountain valleys and demanded payment for safe passage. Some tolls were official, recorded in parchment, others were little more than legalized robbery, Extorted under the threat of violence, muleteers grumbled but merchants paid, calculating that even after such expenses, pepper sold in Paris remained profitable. The Alps were as much political barriers as physical ones, a patchwork of jurisdictions through which every sack of spice had to pass. The strain on animals was relentless. Mules carried heavy loads over steep paths, their hooves slipping on ice, their breaths steaming in the cold. Each evening muleteers checked their beasts for sores where ropes rubbed raw against their sides. A lame mule was a costly loss. Its load had to be redistributed, increasing the burden on the others. When an animal collapsed entirely, it was often left behind, its pack removed, its bell silenced. Muleteers hardened themselves to such loss. To weep for a mule was to show weakness. Better to press forward, for delays risked greater disaster. The men suffered in quieter ways. Thin air left them dizzy, snow blinded them, cold gnawed at their bones. Food was scarce. They carried bread and cheese wrapped in cloth, sometimes dried sausages, but fresh supplies were rare. At night in the hospices, they huddled by fires, their boots steaming, their hands stretched toward the warmth. Stories filled the halls of caravans lost, of bandits killed, of fortunes made in distant markets. Some spoke of turning back, but most pressed on. The wages, meagre as they seemed, were worth more than starvation at home. Merchants endured alongside them, though less gracefully. Accustomed to counting coins in warm lodges, they struggled with the cold and thin air. Wrapped in fur cloaks, they relied on muleteers for guidance and protection. Some complained loudly of delays, fearing losses in distant markets. Others prayed constantly, clutching rosaries or muttering to saints. A few, more pragmatic, joined in the labour, helping to shift loads or push mules across icy ledges. To survive the Alps required humility, even from men used to command. Despite hardship, there was also fellowship. Caravans often joined together for safety. Italians, Germans and Flemings walking side by side, their languages mingling in the cold air. A man from Florence might share wine with a Hanseatic trader. A muleteer from Savoy might trade stories with one from Tyrol. Shared danger broke down barriers of origin. In the snow, all were equal, equally vulnerable, equally dependent on one another's strength. Storms tested this fellowship most severely. Snow fell in blinding sheets. Winds howled through passes and paths vanished beneath drifts. Men roped themselves together, tying merchants and muleteers alike into chains, lest one slip drag others to death. Torches flickered uselessly, extinguished by the gale. Progress slowed to a crawl, measured in steps rather than miles. Hospices became sanctuaries in such times, their bells guiding lost travellers through fog and snow. Many muleteers swore that without those bells, half the caravans would never have survived. Every sack of pepper that crossed the Alps bore the memory of such struggles. When it reached Paris or Bruges, its price reflected not only distance but danger. Buyers rarely thought of this. They weighed pepper on scales, sniffed it for quality, argued over its worth, but seldom imagined the avalanches, bandits and storms it had survived. Only the muleteers and merchants knew the truth, that each grain carried the silence of snowfields, the cries of ambush, the toll of exhaustion. And so the question lingers. In the great halls of Paris where pepper was sprinkled over feasts, how many nobles realised that its sharp taste was seasoned not only by India's sun, but by the cold breath of the Alps, by the labour of mules, and by the quiet endurance of men who walked beside them. At last, after weeks of climbing, slipping and enduring the high silence of the peaks, caravans descended into valleys where grass returned, rivers widened, and villages clustered along the roads. The mules, weary but steady, quickened their pace when they smelled fodder and stables ahead. The merchants sighed with relief. The most dangerous part was behind them. Yet their journey was far from finished. The goods still had to be delivered, inspected, sold, and transformed into wealth in the towns and cities beyond the Alps. When a caravan reached a market town on the northern side, places like Basel, Augsburg or Strasbourg, the first task was to account for losses. The muleteers untied their beasts, unloading sacks with stiff hands. Merchants checked the wax seals, weighed the pepper, and compared the numbers to the records they had written before crossing the passes. There were always discrepancies. A sack torn open in an avalanche, another dampened by snowmelt, a load abandoned when a mule collapsed. Each loss reduced profit and raised questions. Ledgers recorded it all in neat columns, one sack spoiled, one missing. Markets in these towns became miniature summits of Europe's trade. Spices from Venice met wool from England, furs from the Baltic and wines from Burgundy. Inns filled with travellers who spoke a jumble of tongues, their voices mingling with the braying of mules and the clatter of carts. Local craftsmen watched in awe as sacks of pepper were carried through their streets, destined not for them but for nobles and merchants wealthier than they could imagine. The spice smelled exotic, sharp in the cold air, a reminder that somewhere beyond mountains and seas lay worlds most villagers would never see. The muleteers themselves found their reward in these towns. After weeks of hardship, they were paid, often in coin but sometimes in goods they could sell. A single handful of pepper given as part of their wage could fetch a surprising sum in a local market. Most, however, earned only modest silver, enough to support their families and to return for another crossing. They were not remembered in chronicles, but without them, the caravans could not move. Merchants, meanwhile, calculated their next steps. Some sold their pepper immediately, eager to turn cargo into coin. Others stored it in warehouses, waiting for better prices further north. From Basel or Augsburg, goods travelled down rivers on barges floated toward the Rhine and beyond. Pepper bound for Bruges or Paris often passed through multiple towns, taxed at each bridge, counted at each toll. Every stage added cost, but every stage also ensured that the tiny berries reached the tables of Europe's elites. The Alps, then, were not just a barrier, but a filter. They slowed the flow of goods, they increased their value, and they added layers of risk and expense that made pepper more precious still. Every sack that emerged from the passes carried a story of survival, a justification for its high price. Buyers in Bruges or Paris rarely thought of the mountains, but their purses bore the weight of those crossings. Over time, these routes became traditions. Paths widened, bridges improved, tolls standardized. Hospices grew wealthier from donations, their bells continuing to guide travellers. Generations of muleteers passed their knowledge down. Which paths were safest in spring, which inns were fair, which lords demanded bribes disguised as tolls. The rhythm of caravans became part of Alpine life, as predictable as the seasons. And yet, like Bruges before, change came. By the 16th century, new routes by sea around Africa threatened to bypass the Alps entirely. Portuguese ships brought pepper directly from India, flooding Europe with cargoes that no mule could match in volume. The old caravans did not vanish overnight, but their importance faded. The bells of mule trains grew fewer, their trails less crowded. Still, for centuries, it was these silent animals and their guides who carried Europe's wealth across its greatest barrier. Today, when one walks the Alpine trails, some stones still bear the marks of hooves. Hospices remain, their halls lined with centuries of records naming merchants, muleteers, and goods. In museums, old scales and ledgers survive, filled with notes about sacks of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. These are not glamorous relics, but they speak of the unglamorous reality of trade, that behind every feast, every banquet dish spiced with pepper, lay weeks of toil across dangerous paths. And so, the story of the mules ends not with grandeur, but with silence. They were creatures of burden, remembered less for their stubbornness than for their endurance. They carried sacks without complaint, step after step across mountains that defied men. And because of them, pepper crossed into Europe, its value multiplied by every stone, snowfield and toll. So one must ask, when we speak of medieval trade, do we remember kings, merchants and markets too much, and the mule bells too little? For it was their quiet rhythm, echoing through the passes, that truly carried the wealth of continents from one world into another. In shadowed stalls of Paris, merchants weighed peppercorns by flickering candlelight, bargaining in whispers as the rare spice carried fortunes across their scales. By the time pepper reached Paris, it had already travelled farther than most of the city's inhabitants could imagine. It had crossed the Arabian Sea in dhows, passed through the hands of Venetian merchants, climbed the treacherous paths of the Alps, and rattled along river barges toward the French heartland. When it finally arrived at the city's markets, particularly the great square of Les Halles, it was no longer just a spice. It was a symbol of wealth, of connection, of the global threads that tied together places most Parisians would never see. Les Halles in the late Middle Ages was not a quiet place. By dawn, the square already swarmed with carts, donkeys and stall keepers shouting prices. Fishmongers laid out eels still writhing in baskets. Bakers stacked loaves warm from their ovens. Butchers hung sides of beef that dripped onto straw. Among them, tucked into corners and under the eaves of timber-framed stalls, were the spice sellers. Their booths were small, but their wares commanded attention. Pepper was not displayed in open baskets like onions or apples. Instead, it was kept in locked chests. The lids opened only when a serious buyer approached. A scale stood ready on the merchant's table, delicate brass arms balanced on a wooden base, with tiny weights carefully stored in a leather pouch. Beside it lay parchment, quills, and wax seals. Spice merchants were more than vendors. They were accountants, notaries, and guardians of goods more valuable than silver. Buyers came in many forms. Some were cooks for noble households, cloaked against the morning chill, carrying lists written by their masters. Others were innkeepers or tavern owners, hoping to buy a few ounces to flavour their stews and attract wealthy guests. Apothecaries also appeared, seeking pepper for medicines and tonics. Each approached with caution, for pepper was never cheap. Its price fluctuated with the winds of the monsoon, with piracy in the Mediterranean, with taxes at Alpine toll stations. A bag purchased one year might cost double the next. The bargaining was quiet but intense. A cook might ask for 2 ounces, only to balk at the price quoted. The merchant would open his chest, allowing the buyer to inspect the peppercorns. The cook would rub them between his fingers, smell their pungent sharpness, sometimes even bite one. He might claim they were damp, or that the grains were small. The merchant countered with assurances, citing the voyage, the tolls, the dangers endured. Voices rarely rose, but every word carried weight, for a single pinch of pepper could mark the difference between a simple stew and a noble feast. Transactions ended with ceremony. The pepper was weighed on the merchant's scale, measured to the ounce or drachm. The grains were poured into small pouches of cloth or parchment, tied with string and sealed with wax. Payment was made in coin, livres, deniers, florins, or whatever the buyer carried. Often merchants examined each coin closely, testing for clipping or forgery. The exchange took minutes, but in those moments, centuries of global trade condensed into the clink of coin and the scent of spice. For ordinary Parisians who wandered through Les Halles, pepper was more curiosity than commodity. They could smell it in the air, sharp among the odours of fish and meat, but few ever tasted it. A labourer earning a few deniers a day could not afford even a pinch. To him, pepper was something distant, belonging to lords, abbots, and wealthy merchants. He might watch cooks depart with their precious pouches, wondering what food tasted like when seasoned with grains carried from half a world away. At night, when the stalls closed and torches flickered, bargaining continued under candlelight. Wealthier clients often visited spice merchants after hours in the quieter spaces of their counting rooms. There, deals were struck for larger quantities, whole pounds of pepper destined for royal kitchens or cathedral feasts. Merchants spread out ledgers, their pages filled with careful handwriting listing sales, debts and credit. Not all buyers paid in coin. Some offered cloth, wine, or promises of repayment at the next fair. Trust bound these deals as much as contracts did, for the merchant knew that without steady buyers, his business would wither. Pepper thus became woven into the fabric of Parisian life, not for all but for the few. It flavoured the sauces of nobles, it warmed the tonics of physicians, it filled the coffers of merchants. Yet it also sparked questions among those left out. Was it worth so much coin, this small black grain? Why should nobles sprinkle it freely while common folk struggled for bread? Pepper did not only season food, it seasoned the divide between rich and poor. And so, as the candles guttered in spice merchants' lodges, and the last buyers departed, the question remained, did Parisians see pepper as a marvel of far-off lands, or simply as another reminder of how unevenly wealth was measured in their city? If the markets of Les Halles were the stage, then the spice guilds of Paris were the backstage directors, unseen but decisive. Pepper did not flow freely into the hands of any merchant who wished to sell it. Its trade was guarded by regulations, enforced by guilds sworn to maintain order, and overseen by city officials wary of fraud. For in a city where a handful of pepper could equal a week's wages, dishonesty could unravel the entire market. The Spicers Guild, known locally as the Épicier, held authority over who could sell imported goods such as pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. To join required not only money but reputation. Apprentices studied for years under masters, learning how to weigh spices properly, how to detect dampness or adulteration, how to keep ledgers, with neat and honest hand. Only after long service could one open a shop, and even then the guild required oaths of fairness. These oaths were not mere formality. Inspectors from the guild roamed the markets, ensuring that measures were honest and weights correct. Fraud, nevertheless, was common. Pepper might be bulked out with pebbles hidden at the bottom of sacks, or dampened to increase weight. Some unscrupulous sellers mixed inferior berries with good ones, hoping buyers would not notice. The guild punished such practices with fines, sometimes expulsion. Public shame was part of the penalty. A dishonest merchant could find his name posted, his reputation ruined, his clients gone. For in the spice trade, trust was everything. City officials shared in this vigilance. The provost of Paris employed inspectors to check scales, to seize counterfeit coins, and to mediate disputes between buyers and sellers. Ledgers survive in which fines were recorded listing merchants caught cheating. The sums were not trivial. Pepper was taxed heavily at every stage, and the crown had interest in protecting its value. To cheat the buyer was to cheat the king's coffers, and that was treated as a serious crime. Beyond fraud, there were practical concerns. Pepper spoiled if kept in damp places. Merchants therefore stored it in cellars lined with straw, the sacks stacked carefully off the ground. Fires were forbidden near these stores, for spice was too precious to risk. Rats were constant enemies, gnawing through cloth to reach the grains. Cats were kept in warehouses not as pets but as guardians. Some records even mention payments to keepers of cats, a strange but telling detail of how seriously the trade was protected. The rhythm of trade in Paris unfolded with the seasons. In autumn, when caravans from Venice arrived through Alpine passes, pepper was most plentiful. Prices dipped, and cooks bought more freely. By late winter, supplies dwindled and costs rose. Merchants hoarded their remaining sacks, waiting for desperate buyers to pay higher rates. Physicians, in particular, bought pepper year-round, for their patients' ailments did not wait on caravans. Nobles, too, demanded steady supply. Merchants balanced these pressures, holding back just enough stock to profit when scarcity made every ounce more valuable. At night, in the counting rooms lit by tallow candles, merchants reviewed their accounts. Ledgers noted not just sales but debts, who owed coin for last month's purchase, who promised to pay at the next fair in Troy, who had defaulted entirely. Pepper thus became not only a spice but a form of credit. A nobleman might dine on dishes flavoured with pepper purchased on borrowed coin, his feast seasoned by promises yet unpaid. Merchants grew cautious, preferring buyers of strong reputation, and guild rules encouraged collective enforcement. If one man defaulted, others in the guild refused him trade, ensuring that dishonour had consequences. The guild also looked outward. They petitioned city leaders to protect their trade from foreign competition. Italian merchants, who sometimes tried to bypass local rules by selling pepper directly, were forced to work through Parisian guild members. Disputes flared, negotiations dragged, but the guild held firm. The spice trade in Paris would remain in French hands, or at least under French oversight. This insistence helped preserve order, but also inflated prices, for restrictions limited competition. For ordinary Parisians, these rules were invisible. They saw only the end result: pepper sold in tiny packets, priced beyond their reach. To them, the spice remained distant, almost mythical. But the records, inspections, and guild statutes reveal how closely guarded it was. Pepper's value lay not only in its flavour, but in the elaborate scaffolding of trust, law, and habit that sustained it. Still, one question lingered in the minds of many. With so many layers of control, how much of pepper's price reflected its true worth, and how much was built from the fear of fraud, the tolls of lords, and the power of guilds? By the late Middle Ages, pepper was more than a commodity in Paris. It was a marker of identity. To own it, to serve it, to prescribe it, was to signal participation in a wider world of wealth and knowledge. It appeared not only in kitchens and apothecaries, but in the very language and imagination of the city. Its presence was small in size, but immense in meaning. In the kitchens of nobles, pepper was treated with reverence. Cookbooks of the 14th and 15th centuries, such as the Viandier of Taillevent, listed pepper among their essential ingredients. Sources for roasted meats often called for a sprinkling of pepper mixed with vinegar, garlic, and herbs. Dishes of fish, boiled in wine, gained depth from its bite. Pepper did not overwhelm, it sharpened, lifted, and balanced flavours that otherwise would have been heavy or bland. The wealthy measured their refinement not only by the number of servants or the richness of their fabrics, but by the presence of pepper in their food. Feasts in particular displayed this power. At banquets in the halls of kings or bishops, pepper was used liberally, its scent drifting across long tables piled with bread, meat, and wine. To dine on dishes seasoned with pepper was to partake in a ritual of wealth. Guests noticed. Chronicles often mention not only the abundance of meat and fish, but the spices that flavoured them. Pepper was the invisible thread tying Parisian feasts to Indian groves, a subtle but potent reminder of the host's global reach. In humbler taverns, pepper appeared rarely, and when it did, it was a selling point. An innkeeper who could season a stew with even a pinch of pepper attracted wealthier customers. Signs outside taverns sometimes boasted of spiced wine, a mixture of red wine, honey, and pepper. For ordinary travellers, weary from the road, such a drink was both comfort and luxury. The presence of pepper in a tavern cup hinted that one had stumbled upon a place of means. Pepper's role extended beyond food into medicine. Physicians trained at the University of Paris prescribed it according to the theory of humours. Cold and damp illnesses, such as phlegmatic coughs or sluggish digestion, were thought to require heat. Pepper, with its sharp and warming qualities, became a common prescription. Apothecaries ground it into powders, mixed it with honey to soothe throats, or infused it in vinegars and wines. Wealthy patients purchased these remedies readily. Poorer ones could not. Thus, even in medicine, pepper marked the line between classes. To be treated with pepper was to belong to a world that could afford cures beyond herbs gathered in fields. Yet pepper's value also sparked unease. Moralists questioned whether it was right for so much wealth to flow abroad for the sake of seasoning. Preachers warned against gluttony, arguing that the craving for exotic spices distracted Christians from humility. Some writers mocked nobles for scattering pepper carelessly, as if it were grain. Still, these voices did little to diminish demand. Pepper was too embedded in the habits of the elite, too useful to cooks and physicians, too profitable to merchants. Pepper even entered legal and cultural language. Some tenants in Paris paid part of their rent in pepper, a symbolic acknowledgement of its worth. Contracts sometimes referred to a peppercorn rent, meaning a token payment sufficient to seal an agreement. The term outlived the Middle Ages, echoing through centuries of law and commerce. In this way, pepper became both material and metaphor, a grain that carried meanings far beyond its taste. The cultural divide it represented, however, was stark. For the wealthy, pepper was commonplace. For the poor, it was unattainable. A labourer might live his entire life without tasting it, his meals seasoned only with salt, onions, or garden herbs. He might hear of it in sermons, see it weighed at markets, or smell it in noble kitchens, but it remained beyond reach. This inequality was accepted as part of the natural order, yet it underscores how spices shaped not only diets, but divisions of class. By the 15th century, Paris had grown accustomed to pepper. It was no longer a novelty, but a fixture of noble life and professional medicine. Its trade was regulated, its price monitored, its value unquestioned. Yet this stability concealed fragility. Supply still depended on distant seas, Alpine passes, and the delicate balance of merchants in Venice. A storm, a war, or a political disruption could still empty the chests of Parisian spice merchants, sending prices soaring. Behind every pinch of pepper lay uncertainty, and so the story of pepper in Paris closes with a reflection. When nobles sprinkled it over their feasts, when physicians prescribed it to their patients, when merchants counted it by the ounce under candlelight, did they see it as spice, as medicine, as money, or as a fragile thread tying their city to the vast and vulnerable world beyond? Behind closed shop doors, spicers guarded their brass scales, weighing saffron and cinnamon with secrecy, each careful measure a guarded secret of the guild. In medieval Europe, no tool carried greater authority in the spice trade than the merchant's scale. The weight of pepper, cinnamon, or cloves was not guessed or estimated. It was measured, ounce by ounce, drachm by drachm, on delicate balances that determined fortunes. For this reason, the Guild of Spices in Paris, Florence, and other great cities guarded their scales as jealously as knights guarded their swords. A crooked scale meant not only dishonesty but the collapse of trust upon which the entire trade rested. The Spicers Guild was an elite body. Membership was expensive, requiring years of apprenticeship, sponsorship by established masters, and approval by guild officers. Apprentices spent long hours learning not only the smell and taste of spices, but also the precision of weighing. A careless mistake, a balance tilted too far, a weight misplaced, could cost a master his reputation. Accuracy was not simply expected, it was sacred. Inside a spicer's shop, the scale was always in view. Customers expected to see their purchases weighed before their eyes. A chest was opened, the pepper measured into a small brass pan, the counterweight set on the opposite side, and the arms of the balance steadied until they rested level. Buyers leaned in, watching closely, for they knew that a dishonest merchant could shave a few grains from every ounce and grow rich through deceit. The guild, aware of this temptation, enforced strict inspections. Guild officers visited shops unannounced, bringing with them standardized weights stamped with the seal of the city. A merchant whose scales failed the test faced fines, confiscation of goods, or expulsion. But punishment was not the only weapon. The guild cloaked its methods in secrecy. Standard weights were produced and guarded in city halls, locked in chests, brought out only for official use. Apprentices swore oaths never to tamper with scales, never to substitute false weights. Some cities required scales to be chained to counters, making theft or substitution difficult. The rituals surrounding measurement turned it into a near-religious act, a performance that reassured both merchant and customer that fairness was observed. Why such obsession with weighing? Because in the spice trade, every ounce mattered. Pepper was sold in quantities so small that the tiniest fraud multiplied into vast sums. A merchant dealing in sacks could lose or gain fortunes by margins invisible to the naked eye. Customers, noble cooks, physicians, abbots, demanded honesty, and dishonesty could provoke not only lawsuits, but violence. Chronicles tell of riots sparked by rumours of false weights, angry buyers storming shops, demanding restitution. The guild's vigilance was as much about protecting the city's peace as protecting its own reputation. The scales also represented broader systems of trust. In an age without modern banks or credit cards, merchants advanced goods on promises. A nobleman might walk away with pepper purchased on credit, signing a parchment promising repayment at the next fair. Such trust depended on certainty that the initial measurement was honest. If the merchant's scales were doubted, his word was doubted, and the chain of credit collapsed. The guild's reputation therefore extended beyond shops to the very arteries of commerce. Apprentices, as they trained, were taught stories of betrayal, tales of merchants expelled for tampering, of dishonest men whose shops were shuttered. These stories functioned as warnings, reminders that a single act of greed could destroy a career. At the same time, apprentices learned pride. To stand before a scale, to level its arms with a steady hand, was to claim membership in an order that valued precision above all else. Beyond the marketplace, the scales carried symbolic weight. Legal documents sometimes referred to justice as a true balance, invoking the guild's authority as metaphor for fairness itself. Images of scales adorned seals, paintings, and even church carvings, linking the mundane act of weighing pepper to the divine ideal of honesty. Thus, the Spicers Guild did more than guard commerce. It shaped the language of morality. Yet secrecy surrounded their tools. Weights were crafted with care, often from bronze, marked with intricate symbols. Only guild officers knew the full system of marks, allowing them to detect forgeries. Rival merchants complained bitterly of this monopoly, accusing the guild of using secrecy to inflate prices. But the city stood by the guild, for without its vigilance, confidence in the spice trade might falter. And so, in candlelit shops, as merchants lowered their scales and customers peered anxiously at the trembling arms, trust was enacted 1 ounce at a time. Behind each measurement stood not just a merchant, but the invisible authority of the guild, the secrecy of its standards, and the fear of its punishments. Thus we are left with a question. When buyers left a spices shop clutching their tiny pouch of pepper, did they think more of the spice inside, or of the balance that had determined its worth, and the hidden web of rules that made that balance trustworthy? The Spices Guild did not simply guard its scales, it guarded its members. Entry into this world was controlled tightly, for to mishandle pepper was to mishandle wealth itself. Apprenticeships formed the backbone of this protection. A boy entering the trade began his service at perhaps 12 or 13 years of age. His parents paid a fee to a master who clothed, fed and trained him. In return, the apprentice worked long hours sweeping floors, cleaning scales, sealing pouches, and carrying goods. At first, he was not permitted near the balance. He watched instead, standing silently as his master weighed pepper before customers. Only gradually was he allowed to touch the scale, to set weights, to feel the precise moment when its arms hung level. This discipline was repeated until it became instinct. Years passed this way. An apprentice learned not only measurement, but also bookkeeping, writing neat columns of figures, recording sales and debts in ledgers. He memorized the symbols stamped on official weights, learned to detect clipped coins, and studied the art of bargaining, when to lower the price to keep a customer, when to hold firm and let scarcity raise value. By the end of his apprenticeship, he was more than a merchant. He was a guardian of trust. When a journeyman completed his service, he faced the guild's scrutiny. Masters gathered to test him. Could he weigh pepper to the ounce without error? Could he explain the guild's statutes by memory? Could he produce a ledger entry clear and precise enough to withstand inspection? If he passed, he was admitted as a full member, permitted to set up his own shop. If not, he remained a journeyman, wandering from city to city, offering his skills for wages but never claiming full authority. Within the guild, rivalries simmered. Some merchants thrived, securing noble clients and selling pepper by the pound. Others struggled, barely scraping by with small purchases from tavern keepers or apothecaries. Success bred envy, and accusations of fraud often surfaced. A merchant who lost customers might whisper that his rival's scales were tampered. The guild investigated such claims seriously. If dishonesty was found, punishment was swift. Fines, public shaming, or even expulsion. In extreme cases, offenders were barred from trade entirely, their names recorded as warnings to others. Politics threaded through this vigilance. The guild was not a neutral body. It lobbied city officials, secured privileges, and defended its monopoly. Foreign merchants who attempted to bypass guild rules were quickly challenged. Italians selling pepper in Paris, for example, often clashed with the épiciers. The city usually sided with the guild, recognizing that its discipline stabilized trade. But behind these alliances lay constant negotiation. The guild promised order in exchange for protection, a balance as delicate as the scales they guarded. The guild also wielded collective power. If a customer defaulted on payment, refusing to honor his debts, guild members acted together. They denied him further trade, closed ranks, and forced him to settle. In this way, pepper became not only a commodity, but a tool of enforcement. Credit flowed only to those whose reputation remained untarnished. A nobleman who dined on peppered feasts could find himself cut off if he delayed repayment too long. Thus the spice itself became a lever of discipline, extending the guild's reach beyond the market into the households of the elite. Yet secrecy always lingered. Guild meetings were closed to outsiders, their statutes written in guarded language. Apprentices swore oaths never to reveal the guild's inner workings. Rumours spread among common folk that spices possessed hidden weights, known only to masters, used to balance trade in their favour. Whether true or not, such whispers reflected a wider suspicion, that the guild's authority was built as much on mystery as on honesty. Still, without the guild, the trade would have faltered. In an age when most transactions depended on personal trust, the guild offered institutional trust. Buyers knew that scales were inspected, that fraud was punished, that disputes could be judged fairly. Merchants, too, relied on the guild to defend them from false accusations. The guild's seal, stamped on weights and documents, became a symbol stronger than any individual promise. By candlelight in their counting rooms, merchants closed their shops each night by locking their scales away. Some hung them from iron hooks above the counter, others stored them in chests bound with iron bands. To lose a scale was to lose credibility. To be caught with false weights was to lose everything. The guild's insistence on precision gave the spice trade its backbone, turning fragile grains of pepper into reliable units of value. And so, we are left with another thought. Was it truly the pepper that enriched Paris? Or was it the invisible weight of guild discipline, measured ounce by ounce on scales that never ceased to tremble between honesty and suspicion? By the 15th century, the Spicers Guild had become more than an association of merchants. It was an institution of discipline whose reach extended into the broader economy of Paris and beyond. Its weighing scales, so carefully guarded, were not merely tools of measurement. They became symbols of reliability, inspiring other trades to follow its example. In this way, the guild's obsession with honesty and secrecy left a legacy that stretched far beyond pepper. Other guilds watched the spicers closely. The butchers, the bakers, the cloth merchants all saw how the spicers' insistence on standardized weights gave confidence to buyers. They began to adopt similar practices. Bread was weighed on scales approved by guild officers. Cloth was measured with rods marked and sealed by officials. What had begun with pepper became a citywide system of trust, one in which guild oversight ensured that daily life could proceed without constant suspicion. The balance became a civic symbol, appearing not only in guild halls but also carved into public buildings, a reminder that fairness in trade was a foundation of order. The guild's practices also shaped law. City statutes increasingly borrowed from the spicers' rules, codifying punishments for fraud, requirements for honest weights, and protections for buyers. Markets became regulated spaces where disputes could be resolved, through institutions rather than violence. Merchants who once settled disagreements with fists or daggers now submitted to arbitration under guild or civic authority. Pepper thus played an indirect role in taming the rougher edges of urban commerce. Beyond Paris, the influence spread. In Bruges, Lubeck and Florence, spicers' guilds wielded similar authority, though each adapted to local conditions. Venetian merchants, for example, relied less on guilds and more on state officials, but even they respected the principle of standard weights. The very language of trade began to carry the weight of these practices. Contracts referred to true measure, coins were tested against just weight, and honesty in commerce was praised as a virtue akin to piety. For merchants themselves, the guild offered more than regulation. It offered identity. To belong was to claim a place in society higher than the common craftsman, but lower than the nobility. Guild members formed brotherhoods, marched in processions, endowed chapels. Their scales became not only economic tools, but emblems of dignity. A merchant's children could point with pride to the seal of the guild, knowing their family was part of a respected order. And yet, the secrecy that protected the guild also bred resentment. Outsiders grumbled that the spicers manipulated prices, hoarded supplies, and used their monopoly to enrich themselves. In times of scarcity, when pepper prices soared, crowds accused them of profiteering. Riots occasionally broke out, forcing city guards to protect their shops. The very discipline that gave the guild strength also made it a target of suspicion. Over time, the balance between secrecy and openness shifted. As Europe's trade expanded in the 15th and 16th centuries, new financial tools emerged: letters of credit, bills of exchange, banking houses. These instruments required transparency beyond what guild secrecy could offer. Slowly, the authority of the Spicers Guild weakened. Banks and civic institutions took over many of its roles, regulating trade on larger scales. Still, the habits it instilled, precise measurement, careful record-keeping, institutional enforcement, remained embedded in commerce. The legacy of the guild can even be traced to language that endures today. Phrases like "a fair weight," "true balance," or "not worth a peppercorn" echo the medieval world of scales and spices. They remind us that what now seems ordinary, trust in markets, confidence in measures, was once the hard-won achievement of merchants who feared fraud at every turn. Looking back, it is striking how much rested on those trembling balances in candlelit shops. Each time a merchant lowered pepper into a pan, each time a weight was placed on the other side, a performance of trust took place. Buyers believed, sellers swore, and the guild stood behind them both. The economy of Paris, indeed much of Europe, leaned on this daily ritual, repeated thousands of times, unnoticed except when it failed. And so we close the story of the Spicers Guild with a reflection. Was it pepper that gave Europe its taste for fairness? Or was it fairness that gave pepper its enduring place at the table? In the end, perhaps the true legacy of the guild was not the spice itself, but the habit of trust, measured ounce by ounce, on scales that symbolized the balance between honesty and suspicion, secrecy and order. In quiet Florentine chambers, bankers turned heavy pages of dusty ledgers, each line of ink tracing the flow of trade across distant seas. If Paris displayed pepper in market stalls and Bruges counted coins in cloth sacks, Florence preserved the spice trade in ink and parchment. The Florentine banker was not a sailor, nor a muleteer, nor even a spice merchant in the strictest sense. He was a keeper of numbers, a recorder of promises, a man whose dusty ledger determined whether caravans would move, whether merchants could buy, whether nobles could feast. In an age before modern banks, Florence created the habit of trusting paper as much as coin. The city itself hummed with trade. Looms clattered in workshops, dye vats smoked, and the Arno carried barges downstream. Yet behind the noise of cloth-making lay the quieter sound of quills scratching. In narrow rooms above shops, bankers bent over desks, their ledgers spread open, candles guttering in the draught. They dealt not in sacks of pepper, but in entries of credit and debt. To them, the spice was valuable not as flavour, but as collateral, an object whose movement could be predicted, measured and lent against. A Florentine banker's ledger was a thing of order. Thick parchment pages were ruled with lines, creating columns for date, name, amount and destination. Entries were written in steady Gothic script, often in red ink for debts, black for payments. Dust from sand or pumice was sprinkled to dry the ink, leaving the pages grainy to the touch. When the book was closed, it smelled of wax, parchment and candle smoke. Each entry represented not only a sum of money but a link in the vast chain of trade. Consider a merchant from Venice arriving in Florence to finance a shipment of pepper bound for Bruges. He needed coin to buy cargo, to pay muleteers, to cover tolls. The banker advanced him funds, not in heavy sacks of silver, but in a letter of exchange, a document that promised payment in Bruges at the next fair. The Venetian carried no coins across the Alps, only parchment bearing the banker's seal. When he arrived in Bruges, he presented the letter to a Florentine branch there, and his debt was settled. The pepper, in turn, repaid the loan. The banker's ledger recorded it all, a silent witness to the journey. The beauty of this system was its lightness. A caravan of pepper might weigh tons, but its value could be carried in a single piece of parchment. Bandits could seize a mule, pirates could sink a ship, but the banker's ledger endured. The debt remained, the obligation persisted, the balance had to be restored. Pepper thus became not only a spice of flavour, but a spice of numbers, measured as carefully in Florence's counting houses as it was in Parisian markets. For apprentices, learning this craft was as demanding as training under the Spicers Guild. A boy entering a banker's service learned to copy figures with steady hand, to memorise exchange rates between florins, ducats and livres, to calculate interest with precision. He studied double-entry bookkeeping, the method perfected in Italy, where every debit had its credit, every loss its mirror gain. At first the columns seemed lifeless, but soon apprentices realised they were tracing the movements of entire caravans, entire fleets. Numbers told stories, if one knew how to read them. The banker himself lived cautiously. He wore plain robes, carried little coin, and rarely dined extravagantly. His wealth was invisible, hidden in obligations owed and credits extended. Yet his influence stretched across Europe. Kings borrowed from Florentines, popes financed crusades through their accounts, and merchants depended on their letters of exchange. A banker who refused credit could halt a caravan. One who extended it could send pepper flowing into Paris. Still, this trust was fragile. Ledger entries depended on honesty. If a merchant defaulted, if a branch failed, the entire system trembled. Bankers therefore guarded their ledgers fiercely, locking them in chests, sealing them with wax and swearing apprentices to secrecy. A misplaced page, a smudged entry, could mean ruin. Accuracy was as sacred here as on the Spicers' scales, and yet even bankers knew the scent of pepper. Though they did not handle it daily, they smelled it when merchants brought sacks as collateral, when caravans unloaded in Florence's warehouses. They touched the grains, rubbed them between fingers, not as cooks but as financiers, gauging quality and imagining profit. To them, pepper was a number first, a taste second. Its sharpness was felt more in the quill's scratch than in the tongue's bite. Thus Florence added a new layer to the spice trade, the abstraction of wealth. The pepper that left India travelled not only in sacks and caravans, but also in numbers inked on parchment. By the time it reached Paris, it had already passed through Florence's books, weighed not in ounces but in columns of debt and credit. And so we are left with a thought. When a Florentine banker closed his ledger at night, did he think of pepper as a spice of the senses or as a spice of numbers, an invisible wealth that lived only in ink, yet bound together the fates of merchants, muleteers and nobles across Europe? If the ledger was the heart of Florentine banking, the letter of exchange was its lifeblood. With it, money became portable, promises became tangible, and the flow of pepper and spice could continue without the weight of silver. In the dim candlelight of Florence's counting houses, quills dipped in ink transformed caravans and fleets into neat lines of script. A letter of exchange was deceptively simple. Written on parchment, it recorded an obligation. One party promised to pay another at a certain place, on a certain date, in a certain currency. It carried seals and signatures, but no coin. To those unfamiliar, it seemed flimsy, a scrap of paper. But to merchants and bankers, it was worth as much as sacks of gold. It allowed a Venetian trader to buy pepper in Alexandria without carrying silver through pirate-filled seas. It allowed a Parisian cook to season his master's table without ever seeing the original coin that paid for the pepper. Florentine bankers perfected the art of these letters. They established branches in Bruges, London, Avignon and beyond. A merchant could deposit money in Florence, receive a letter, and redeem it in Bruges for local currency. The banker's ledger recorded both sides of the transaction, ensuring that no figure disappeared. This system demanded not only precision but trust. Trust that the banker's branch abroad would honour the letter, trust that the merchant would repay his debts, trust that the ledger in Florence matched the ledger in Bruges. Partnerships sustained this trust. Florentine firms were often family affairs, with cousins and brothers managing branches across Europe. The Medici, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, these names became synonymous with vast webs of obligation. Letters of exchange tied together cousins in Florence, agents in London, and partners in Bruges. A sack of pepper purchased in Venice might appear in 3 ledgers before it ever crossed the Alps, its value multiplied, loaned, or pledged as collateral. Yet the system was fragile. Defaults could ripple like cracks in glass. When King Edward III of England failed to repay loans in the 1340s, Florentine firms collapsed. Ledgers once filled with promises suddenly recorded only losses. Merchants who had trusted those bankers found themselves ruined. Pepper still moved, but its paper shadow crumbled. Such failures reminded bankers that their dusty books held not only wealth, but risk. Daily work in a Florentine counting house reflected this tension. Apprentices copied exchange rates. How many florins equaled a Venetian ducat? How many pounds sterling equaled a livre tournois? These rates changed constantly, driven by supply, demand and political events. A war in France could devalue its coin. A glut of silver from German mines could shift balances. Bankers watched these changes with hawk-like attention, adjusting their letters accordingly. The work was quiet, but not dull. Conversations hummed, reports from Bruges of pepper prices, news from Genoa of pirate raids, rumours from Venice of shortages. Every figure in the ledger corresponded to some distant event, some risk carried on waves or across mountains. To read a ledger was to read the world. The guild of bankers in Florence enforced discipline much like the spices in Paris. False entries, dishonest dealings or reckless loans could lead to expulsion. Bankers' reputations mattered more than their robes. A firm known for honesty attracted clients across Europe. One suspected of trickery quickly withered. Trust was everything, and ledgers were its proof. Even the physical books reflected this seriousness. Many were massive, bound in wooden boards, their parchment pages thick and resistant to tampering. Margins were wide, leaving room for notes. Some pages bore water stains or smudges of wax from long nights by candlelight. Dust clung to their surfaces, for they were handled daily, yet rarely cleaned. They were not showpieces but working tools, repositories of obligations that stretched across continents. For the ordinary Florentine, these ledgers were invisible. A weaver heard their echo only when wages arrived late, because a merchant's letter had not been honoured. A tavern keeper noticed them only when a banker refused credit to a customer. Yet these dusty books shaped the rhythm of the city as much as the clang of looms or the toll of bells. Florence's prosperity rested as much on ink as on wool, and pepper, always pepper, threaded through these numbers. Its steady demand made it reliable collateral. Its small size made it easy to transport and pledge. Its high price made it worthy of loans. In many ledgers, the word Piper Nigrum appears again and again, a shorthand for wealth flowing through Florence. The bankers may not have tasted it often, but their fortunes rested on its weight. Thus, the spices of Paris and the muleteers of the Alps depended unknowingly on the dusty books of Florence. Without letters of exchange, without the trust recorded in neat Gothic script, the flow of spice would have slowed, and without pepper, the ledgers themselves might have been thinner, the quills less busy, the counting rooms quieter, and so the question remains. When a Florentine banker ran his finger down a column of debts and credits, did he see only numbers, or did he sense the faraway caravans, the mule bells, the shipholds, and the Parisian feasts hidden between the lines? For all their precision, Florentine bankers could not always control the tides of fortune. The ledgers that seemed to anchor trade were, in truth, as vulnerable as ships at sea. Credit depended on kings, popes, and merchants keeping their word. When they failed, the neat columns of debt and credit unravelled, and entire firms collapsed like houses of parchment. The 14th century gave dramatic proof. The great Bardi and Peruzzi banks, whose branches reached across Europe, lent heavily to King Edward III of England to finance his wars against France. At first, the loans seemed sound, secured by promises of wool exports and royal revenue. But when Edward defaulted in 1345, the consequences were catastrophic. Ledgers filled with royal debts suddenly became worthless. The Bardi and Peruzzi went bankrupt, their branches closed, their apprentices dismissed. Merchants who depended on their letters of exchange found themselves stranded without credit. The pepper trade slowed, not because caravans ceased, but because paper no longer supported their movement. Florence reeled, but it adapted. Out of the ashes rose new firms, most famously the Medici Bank, which learned from past mistakes. The Medici avoided lending too heavily to monarchs, spreading risk across many clients. They diversified into wool, mining, and art patronage, embedding their influence in every aspect of Florentine life. Their ledgers became models of caution and clarity, studied by later generations. Pepper once again appeared in their accounts, proof that even after collapse the spice remained too valuable to ignore. The crises revealed the double nature of the ledger. On the one hand, it was a tool of order, a way of transforming sacks of pepper into lines of credit. On the other, it was a mirror of human fragility. No matter how carefully figures were inked, they could not force kings to repay or guarantee safe passage through war-torn lands. The ledger was powerful but not invincible, yet its legacy endured. Florentine methods of double-entry bookkeeping spread across Europe. Merchants in Bruges, London, and Paris copied their system of recording debits and credits. Cities adopted their practice of balancing accounts annually, of preserving ledgers as legal proof. What had once been an innovation became habit. Even as Florence's dominance waned, its dusty books left their imprint on the future. The ledgers also reshaped how people thought about wealth. Coin was tangible, heavy, reassuring, but the ledger proved that numbers could represent reality just as firmly. A promise inked in Florence could move caravans in the Alps, sacks of pepper in Bruges, and feasts in Paris. Trust shifted from metal to paper, from hoarded silver to shared obligation. This transformation was as significant as any battle or treaty. It allowed Europe to think globally, to imagine wealth that stretched across borders and seas. Apprentices trained in Florence carried this habit elsewhere. Some became bankers in foreign cities, bringing their methods with them. Others served as agents for merchants, trusted because they could keep books accurately. In their wake, the practice of accounting spread, embedding itself in the very fabric of trade. Pepper may have been the spark, but the ledger became the flame that lit Europe's commercial revolution. And still, the books themselves tell stories. Surviving ledgers, preserved in archives, reveal the daily life of banking. One finds entries noting shipments of pepper from Venice, repayments made in Bruges, defaults recorded in terse Latin phrases. The handwriting is steady, the ink faded, the parchment stained with candle soot. To modern eyes, they may appear dull, endless lists of numbers. But within them lies the pulse of medieval trade, the silent rhythm of spice turned into debt, debt into credit, credit into survival. By the 16th century, Florence's great banking houses had declined. Political turmoil, shifting trade routes, and the rise of other powers reduced their influence. Yet the habit of writing, recording, and balancing endured. It migrated northward, influencing Antwerp, Amsterdam, and eventually London. Modern capitalism owes as much to these dusty Florentine books as it does to the voyages of explorers or the decrees of kings. Pepper, meanwhile, lost some of its mystique. As Portuguese ships brought spices directly from India, their price fell, and they became more common in European kitchens. But the legacy of the Florentine ledger outlasted Pepper's novelty. The discipline learned in counting spices translated into managing silver from the Americas, textiles from Asia, and eventually global empires. What began with Pepper ended with a new way of seeing the world, not as sacks of goods, but as columns of numbers, endlessly comparable, endlessly tradable. So we close the tale of Florence's bankers with a reflection. When we leaf through their dusty ledgers today, do we see only ink, faded and dry? Or do we glimpse the invisible caravans, the ships, the mule trains, and the Parisian cooks, whose fates were bound together by those numbers? Perhaps the true spice of Florence was not pepper at all, but the art of writing debt, the transformation of trade into trust, and the enduring lesson that sometimes the sharpest bite comes not from the tongue but from the pen,